69.
And we'll see whether this microphone works, okay? You can't escape the fan noise, front or back, plus we've got the projector. But it's really important, I would like to emphasize, in sessions like this, to let speakers know if you can't hear. Stand up, jump up and down, because we really want you to understand what we're saying also. It's not rude. So, for the third time, the Midwestern History Association is meeting in Grand Rapids, offering local citizens here opportunity to stay on the cutting edge burgeoning field of Midwestern studies. So thanks to the Howenstein Center of Grand Valley State University, from Grand Rapidians and visiting academics alike for making it so easy. I'm Joellen Clary, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a panel organized by the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council. Initially, some MHA panels were planned to overlap with the efforts of the Agricultural History Society's conference piggybacking on this one over the next few days. Its framing question, who is a farmer, in fact informs this panel's focus on Midwestern rural and urban women who organized the nation's food programs during wartime for the 1917 Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. This federal wartime agency was charged with managing the nation's women for the war effort. And by the way, the conference, the Agricultural History Society, is starting tomorrow. They'll be in the Eberhard Center, and if you're not registered, maybe you can sneak in at 10:30 Friday morning to hear Jason Otto's paper, which will supplement paper you'll hear today on women's public gardening programs. Only in recent years has information about the Women's Committee activities finally begun making its way into accounts of U.S. women's history. Today's pioneering work on American women during wartime on the local, state, and national levels launches a 3-year project by the Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council on women's wartime efforts, creating a home defense by guaranteeing healthy food sources, raising healthy children, and ensuring the health of women in the industrial workforce. This year food, next year the children's year, the next year work on women in industry. This widespread war work has to date been very, very little known, surprisingly little known, even by American women's historians. And you can't credit what you don't know. So we thank you for your interest in joining us to honor World War I era women and to rectify this lapse in accounts of American history. On this year's panel, on your right, Anita Anthony Van Orsdale will illustrate how demand for farm products ensured important roles for Midwestern women in the national movement. Then, using the experiences of women from rural Jasper County, Indiana, and urban women from Grand Rapids, Sue Caldwell in the center will elaborate on top-down management problems faced by local groups, and Jason Otto will demonstrate how women's pre-war programs thrived when given a federal mandate. So women's reform movements were already in gear. They got things really done when the government got involved and gave them some help. The Greater Grand Rapids Women's History Council's education about women's World War I activities began in Grand Rapids in 2006 when a treasure trove of genealogical, sociological, and historical data on local women in May 1918 was rediscovered in the public library. And that's the subject of the flyer that I gave you. Further research into these war registration cards for women, conducted by Diana Barrett, led us to the national effort. We'd never heard of the Women's Committee of the CND, and a lot of other people hadn't either. The enrollments of 23,000 Grand Rapids area women now offers a census of half the city's female adult population in 1918, using well over 100 fields. Michigan enrolled 900,000 women overall, more than any other state. The Grand Rapids collection is the largest of the very few collections so far discovered throughout the United States, and it has prompted research beyond the card collection itself, some of which you will hear today. The Grand Rapids Public Library, with the help primarily of the Western Michigan Genealogical Society, has been entering data into a database that we hope within the year will be fully searchable. you want to see all the women who were African American, spoke French, and drove a car and would go anywhere in the world for war work, we hope it will spit that out. That may be ambitious, but you get the idea. So, about 5 years after this strike in Grand Rapids, genealogist Sue Caldwell uncovered a complete card collection in rural Jasper County, Indiana. 3,200 of over 600,000 completed statewide in Indiana. In contrast to the urban data from Grand Rapids, the Indiana collection provides a detailed portrait of an entire county's rural women. And the Indiana material is more extensive. Sue has an original storage cabinet, custom designed by the Council of National Defense, filled with correspondence, newspaper clippings, and masses of data documenting the county's efforts and difficulties during World War I. Many of the materials, of course, concern food history, from which she'll draw her paper today. Then, prompted by the 2006 discovery in Grand Rapids, Anita Anthony Benorsdale began research resulting in her 2015 Michigan State University dissertation. 2016. Ooh, I'm sorry. Just last year, I just recognized my error. Which can now tutor local and academic women's historians alike on the broader context in which the cards live, on the formation and functioning of the federally mandated Women's Committee. Really, the suffrage movement ran it. They couldn't say their name, but it was the suffrage movement nationwide and its structure that made all this work. On the social and political ramifications of its existence. Before her work, virtually no attention, a little, but virtually no attention, had been paid this group, arising out of decades-long 19th century women's reform movements. Anthony Benorsdale illuminates the link between their past in social reform and their new formal position as citizens with that federal mandate. And Jason Otto has done programming along this line, having discovered, coming from doing farmers market history initially in public gardening and realizing he was doing women's history, and there was this women's committee connection. In a nutshell then, this panel will elaborate the national context by focusing on the role of the Midwest in the development and functioning of thousands of women's committees for the Council of National Defense. Sue Caldwell's and Jason Otto's on-the-ground reports about the county-wide engagement of rural Indiana women and the public gardening and broader food efforts of Grand Rapids urban women will supplement Anthony Benorsdale's introductory, broader depiction of wartime women's food history on Midwestern ground. They will integrate local histories into the national story, illustrating how organized women enacted social and political change through their wartime food efforts. So, in addition to her dissertation in this area at Michigan State University, Anita has studied a 1967 race riot in Grand Rapids and its effect on housing, education, and jobs in the African American community here, on the 1969 strike of the International Union of Electrical Workers against General Electric, and the resulting disillusionment of conservative union workers in Holland, Michigan. Currently, she's developing research on how women's ages affect their involvement in social welfare activism, focusing on 3 20th century attempts to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. But today, how food history makes history.
Okay, thank you everybody. I tend to be a little bit loud anyway, so if I'm too loud with the microphone, please let me know. I will try not to yell too much. I'll use my slightly quieter teacher voice today. Thank you so much to Joellen and to the panel organizers for this great conference, to my fellow panelists today, and to all of you for coming out. Beautiful day, and I'm so glad to see so many of you came out to sit in a classroom with the rest of us, right? So today, as Joellen mentioned, I'm giving sort of a national overview, and we're going to focus in a little bit closer on the Midwest in particular. With lots of examples from Michigan, but also, not to step on Sue's toes, a little from Indiana and some from Illinois as well, and also from Minnesota. But really, when we're looking at creating this army of housewives, as I've called it, it's an approach that was nationwide. But because of the different regional agricultural demands and needs and abilities, we'll find that what the Women's Committee will do is leave this idea of food programs pretty open-ended, because again, what you plant in Michigan is going to be much different than what you can plant in southern Florida. That makes sense to a lot of us. So if we start out with a simple question of who is a farmer, this gets a little bit complicated because, of course, as historians, what do we like to do? We like to complicate things immediately. But it does get complicated because we also have to ask, what are you farming for? Right? And what we'll find out is that the Women's Committee, they have a couple of different things that they're concentrating on, particularly. Let me go back here, we got something in the way. And in particular, here's a couple of common posters that we'd see not only in the Midwest, but across the United States, as the Women's Committee in 1917 are really quickly trying to figure out ways to become involved in the food program. Now, why would they do this? Well, why would they promote things like to be patriotic, sign their countries, pledge to save the food? This was a very common poster used. As you can see, very similar to this one, we have this sort of Lady Liberty look, right, with the American flag costume. And if you can see on this one, it says at the bottom of it, this is a poster by the U.S. Food Administration. And then we have posters by the National War Garden Commission. And posters by someone who's not named, or a group who's not named. This is quite common during World War I. There's going to be a lot of women, a lot of groups involved, with this food program. So why patriotism? How does farming and patriotism go together? Well, during World War I, immediately, as soon as war is declared by Congress at the beginning of April in 1917, there's an immediate demand for food. Food for soldiers going overseas, food for the Allied powers already in the war, but also demands for civilian or domestic food. There's a great concern in 1917 in the Midwest and across parts of the Great Plains because there was a drought that was already happening. So there was concerns about food production already going on even before the U.S. joined the war effort. If you see this poster up here, one of the primary focuses of the Women's Committee, who will eventually partner with the U.S. Food Administration, another new wartime program, federal branch, who's the U.S. Food Administration is being run by Herbert Hoover. Now, most of us have heard his name at least once before, right? Herbert Hoover. Let's forget about the Great Depression. We're not even to that point yet. But Herbert Hoover becomes famous during World War I because he organizes initially a nonprofit voluntary organization for food relief for Belgians. Okay? And then afterwards, that catches the attention of Woodrow Wilson, and President Wilson will ask him to head up the U.S. Food Administration. And he does that. It's his first real federal appointment, and he's remarkably successful. And part of the reasons for Hoover's success is because Wilson and the other wartime leaders, including Secretary of War Newton Baker, say, we have to make this voluntary. You can't go into Americans' homes to ask American families to just ration food. You have to make this voluntary. And along with those voluntary measures comes a new problem. Even though these programs are voluntary, there's not a real set idea of the goals of the program, besides to provide for the civilian or domestic food market, and perhaps to provide more food products for Allied and American soldiers. There's no specific goals, though, besides just those generalized ones. So the kitchen really became the key to victory. And what we'll see happening is that the Women's Committee led the ranks at first. And there's going to become some problems because, well, the Women's Committee was given federal authority to organize the nation's women for wartime needs, including food. They oftentimes ran into problems with these new federal branches. As I mentioned, the U.S. Food Administration in this case. Now, the U.S. Food Administration was given broad powers over food production, distribution, and also conservation. So the Women's Committee would become involved in those three key areas of food, going beyond maybe the farmer in the field and thinking about how to distribute food in different ways that will become easier for women to obtain during the war. Of course, the Women's Committee is not allowed to vote on any of these food measures. They are simply an auxiliary committee meant to offer advice to the U.S. Food Administration and the Department of Agriculture. They're meant to offer some ideas to them, but really they don't have a voting interest, unlike members such as Hoover. They also have about 4 million members by the end of the war in the Women's Committee. But these numbers are misleading because those 4 million women are only the women who registered with the Women's Committee. Joellen talked briefly about the number of cards available in Grand Rapids. These cards are a little bit bigger than a recipe sort of index card, and it lists lots of things that women were already doing. So the Women's Committee asked that women not necessarily relearn a bunch of new skills, but to take the skills they already had and to put those into place for food production. Okay. So even though it says 4 million members, again, that's a little misleading. By the end of the food program, 14 million people participated in those food programs. 14 million across the United States. And to give some idea of who was in this as far as women go, you had to be age 16 and above to participate in the official food programs of the Women's Committee. Although they will have a children's wing that kids under the age, women and girls under the age of 16 can participate. So one of the first problems that happened is that the Women's Committee had to negotiate their relationship with the Food Administration. And in charge of the Women's Committee, we have Anna Howard Shaw. If you don't know that name, let me give you a little background on who this woman is. Right over here is Anna Howard Shaw. She is the former president of the, she's the former president of NASA, the suffrage group. And not only is she was the former president of NASA, but she's sort of been given the reins to take over the suffrage movement. She would quit this position just as the U.S. enters the war. Why would she quit as the director of suffrage in the United States, of women's suffrage efforts? Well, to be honest, it's because the Wilson administration during World War I told these women who would become the directors of the Women's Committee, explicitly told them in a letter that they were not allowed to ever talk about suffrage through this committee. So while Joellen's right, this is staffed by mostly suffragists, well, we also have a few anti-suffragists, and maybe some middle-of-the-road kind of suffragists. But in general, it's mostly a suffrage movement, but they're banned from talking about suffragism. So while they cannot address those issues, they can address different ways that women can participate in this war. Obviously, there's laws in place at the time. Women can't pick up guns, they can't join the army in traditional ways, or in ways that men can. So they have to sort of rethink how they're going to express their women's citizenship during World War I. If you're looking at this, Anna Howard Shaw, as I said, heads up the Women's Committee. She's their national director, but she co-chairs that position with Ida Tarbell, seen right here. Ida Tarbell, muckraking journalist who would become famous for her exposés, really, of people and businesses such as Standard Oil and Rockefeller, who were doing some pretty bad business practice if you were in the working class and looking from that point. But those two women were essentially in charge of most of the food programs for the Women's Committee. Anna Howard Shaw is the director of the entire committee, and Ida Tarbell not only is their press wing for the Women's Committee, but also as their federal food program director. Well, once Wilson created the U.S. Food Administration, in fact, just a few weeks after the Women's Committee's officially created, now all of a sudden Herbert Hoover's been part of this. So while women were hoping to get national level direction from Anna Howard Shaw and Ida Tarbell, sent down to state level directors such as Carolyn Bartlett Crane, who directed the Michigan division for the Women's Committee, and her picture's right here. Instead of just working on that sort of level, now they have to include in Herbert Hoover as Food Administration Director. Hoover had such success with that Belgian Relief Committee that he decided to sort of design the Food Administration along similar lines. Voluntary, but also to use a lot of the nation's women. However, Hoover didn't really want much input from Ida Tarbell or from Anna Howard Shaw on how to run anything to do with the Food Administration. He wanted their help, but he didn't want to hear their advice. So while Hoover is working pretty hard with the Food Administration during this time, there's going to be some constant issues going back and forth between these two. Ida Tarbell, in her 1939 autobiography, would refer to Hoover as a food dictator during the war. And she had some pretty other nasty things to say about him in general. But she comes to the conclusion that without Herbert Hoover, then that the Women's Committee really can't do the food programs that they want. Why? Well, because as Tarbell will tell her readers, part of that reason is because the Women's Committee is only allowed to direct the nation's women for the war. What about the bakers? What about the commercial distributors? What about the canning companies? Those are run by men with lots of male employees. So you need someone with a broader scope of federal powers, which is Hoover at that time. So he's set in charge of the Food Administration and ultimately the food programs. But it's the women who put ideas into action. One of the very first things that was suggested to Midwestern women especially, because a large amount of produce can be grown in Michigan, was to put enough away to feed your own. Feed your own families first. Plant some more gardens. Absolutely participate in what they call community kitchens. We'll explain in a minute. But the idea was to put enough away for your own family. And in the process, during this war, you would remove your family from commercial food lines. So in other words, these women wouldn't have to go to the grocery store to buy canned goods. And the majority of women are buying factory canned goods at this point. We like to think that these women were all cooking from scratch, and they're not. They're buying their bread, they're buying their canned goods, they're buying their meat from a butcher shop, even women in the countryside. So there's this idea if they pull families out of the domestic food market, that those products then that these women would buy for their own families would end up going into the war effort to be sent overseas, to free up those markets, if you will. In Michigan and across the Midwest, there's a lot of concentration on going beyond just planting a home garden. So if you have the room for it, set a beehive, keep some chickens. I know some of us are thrilled about the idea of keeping urban chickens. Right? But this is what they did. I mean, could you imagine if your neighbor put up a beehive in their backyard right next door to you in the city? Some of us would be like, oh, great. Most people weren't thrilled at these ideas. And in fact, in some parts of the country, there was even a push to start killing off your cats and dogs. Why? Because you would have to feed them. Why would you waste food on animals when there's a war going on? I know, it sounds a little nuts. By the way, the Food Administration actually encouraged women and men to actually eat their domestic pets. Eat your cat, eat your dog. That's a little nuts to us today. The Women's Committee didn't embrace those ideas, so I'll let you know that. They also, during this, for the first year of the Women's Committee, you'll see their program's going to focus mostly on food. They'll continue that in 1918 and even towards the beginning of 1919 once the war is over, because food needs will continue after the war. Well, one of the largest areas of benefits long-term from these food programs was nutritional research. And this would lead on to other programs within the Women's Committee, specifically children's health and well-being. Ideas of malnutrition were coming out at this point as more and more men were being drafted into service. They found out that almost a third of them were malnourished as children. So food programs took on a different level of significance, that if we can provide enough food during World War I for these young people, that if there ever is another war, we'll have a healthy enough generation to fight it again. And by the way, their children who they fed in 1917 and 18 will go on to serve in World War II. So there's this spread of not only nutrition research, but this idea of promoting healthy eating. Before World War I, most middle-class American families enjoyed lots of sauces, lots of butter and wheat and all these good things. But after or during World War I, what happened is certain ethnic recipes and racial recipes, if we'd like to call them that, began to spread across the United States. So things, instead of making your wheat-based bread to have with dinner, or your rolls made out of wheat, you would make cornbread. We make baked beans instead of a New England wonderful beef roast. Right? I can tell it's after lunch, no one's getting excited about this. So we have this spread of these recipes going across the country, and they're filtered through the Women's Committee. Even though the Women's Committee couldn't vote on food timing measures with the Food Administration, they could shape those programs by taking in recipes from women all over the country, analyzing those recipes for nutritional content, and to make sure they didn't use the products that the war was demanding from farms, especially butter, wheat, and beef, as well as pork. Over here, I've got a couple of images. This is the Kalamazoo, Michigan headquarters for the Michigan Division of the Women's Committee. Even though there's a national committee, each one of the states, as well as all the U.S. territories, had a state or territory division. So for example, they have a territorial division in Alaska, they'll have one in Guam, they'll have one in Washington, D.C., and then spread out through the other states as well. These state divisions oftentimes were in larger cities. Michigan would pick Kalamazoo for a couple of pretty easy reasons and a couple of not so easy reasons. One of the reasons they picked Kalamazoo is because the state divisional director, Carolyn Bartlett Crane, made Kalamazoo her home and she didn't want to leave it. Okay. The other reason why Kalamazoo was chosen was because it wasn't Detroit. Let that absorb for just a second. It wasn't Detroit. Why? Well, Detroit had demanded their own separate women's committee, unaffiliated with the state. Because Detroit women thought that their town, their city was so huge, it needed its own little separate division. And this, of course, made Carolyn Bartlett Crane, director of the Mission Division, very angry. So we have really no records from Detroit. So when we talk about 900,000 women signed up for the Women's Committee, that does not include anything from Detroit. Right? But over here, you can see in the background, we have not only some packages of bandages that were made for the Red Cross, but, and they're kind of hard to see, there's home canned goods that will be stacked up in this storefront window downtown in Kalamazoo. This, again, was helpful to show women what they could contribute to the war effort without taking on a bunch of new skills, without volunteering hours a week to go to a Red Cross headquarters. They could sit in their kitchens or in their homes, watch their children, do their normal daily lives, and still contribute to the war effort. One by one, little by little, it all added up. Over here, this top image, this is from the Allegan County Fair. If you've ever been to the Allegan County Fair, it still happens every year in September. But in Allegan County in Michigan, these women were putting on a bread baking show. How to bake bread without using wheat. Something that most of us have heard about with the gluten-free trends going on right now. Well, these women had designed recipes that purposely didn't use wheat, butter, and other things that the Allied powers that they needed for food. So these women are putting on a wartime bread recipe sort of cooking demonstration. Down here, it's also from the Allegan County Fair, and they're showing some posters, but also showing what can be grown in Michigan. For example, right here are a couple of apples, we have some tomatoes, and showing women different ways to use these locally grown fruits and vegetables. The Women's Committee also heavily engaged with using children as a support system. for these food programs. How did they do this? Well, first and foremost, they began to make partnerships with parent-teacher organizations, parent-teacher associations. So these women already involved in the Women's Committee could talk to individual teachers and still manage to convince them to start integrating food programs into their daily classroom lessons. Brief example of this. After the lunch hour at school, children were told to go over to their trash containers in their classrooms, dump out the contents onto the floor, hopefully they put something down, but to dump the contents out on the floor and to look for waste. Did you only eat half your apple at lunch? You wasted that. A poor child in France could have eaten something like that. Right? This is where that myth of the child in China comes from, I swear. It's horrible. So children were used as a support system. They also handed out Hoover food cards. These Hoover food cards, and I lost my place here. These Hoover food cards, you're going to hear more about that in just a minute from Sue. But these Hoover food cards were part of the U.S. Food Administration. They wanted to see how many women were going to participate with food programs. And the National Women's Committee are at first reluctant to support this food pledge from the U.S. Food Administration. Why? Well, for a few specific reasons. One of their biggest areas of concern was this food pledge. This food pledge that you see right here actually comes from the Chicago Tribune. But this is common. They were published in the newspapers. If you can read, I know it's in small print, they're kind of open-ended. It didn't tell women what was demanded of them. In other words, it didn't say, this is what we'd like you to do for the war effort. It just said that you promise to make sure that you conserve food. Places such as agricultural colleges, this is a picture of Morrill Hall over at Michigan State University, which was Michigan Agricultural College at the time. These agricultural colleges, their home economics departments were heavily involved in these food programs, going out to teach extension services, extension classes to women the proper canning techniques so they didn't get some sort of horrible bacteria in their canning, and so forth. And this right down here is a picture of Otsego and their canning efforts as well. The other problem is distribution. Immediately, Michigan had a problem with distributing food. So women were asked to can things, were asked to preserve things, but women in cities such as Grand Rapids and other larger cities like Kalamazoo didn't have access to food to can or to preserve or anything else. So Carolyn Bartlett Crane, Michigan Division Director, begins to set up this redistribution of food program. Instead of using large commercial canning facilities, home canning was encouraged, of course, but also was community canning, where a group of women would bring in whatever vegetables and produce they had. They would cook these things together, they would can them together, and then distribute them around their membership. So if you brought in a whole bushel of tomatoes, not only would you can those tomatoes, but if your friend brought in a bushel of green beans, you'd leave with green beans and tomatoes. These were common during this time. Ultimately, 14 million women participate in these food programs, as I said before. But including not just those women, lots of men participated. This is why the numbers aren't very accurate. Men weren't reported. A lot of women weren't reported. For example, Chicago, in 1 week, had over 250,000 people show up to food demonstrations. In 1 week, in the middle of January, by the way. So that's pretty impressive. So these sort of things went all over the place. Men such as, there's a great story out of Minnesota of a bunch of loggers, lumberjacks coming down to learn new recipes because they didn't have access to low-cost recipes. So even though the Women's Committee, their food programs took on a variety of efforts, again by local area and by region where they were growing these crops, what ends up happening is that it's not a horribly challenging program for women to join. But the idea was you remove your families from the food chain, if you will, then that food can be given over for the war effort.
forth here. After completing a graduate degree in management at St. Joseph's College in Rensselaer, Indiana, Sue Caldwell spent nearly 30 years as CFO of Bank One Rensselaer and in project management for JPM Chase and Bank One. Since her retirement 10 years ago, she has concentrated on other roles. She's become a math woman, in fact, as Director at Large of the Indiana Genealogical Society, as Jasper County Genealogist for IGS, and as a director on the board of the Jasper County Historical Society. And they have a lovely little museum and an old church with lots of things in it besides that cabinet that has the cards. Besides such projects as cemetery preservation, Caldwell is working her way through the Historical Society Museum's fabulous genealogical collections, including stunning materials surrounding its women's registration cards for the World War I Council of National Defense. Since discovering the registration cards and all that contextual data in 2011, Caldwell has been organizing and analyzing this material, as well as disseminating information in hopes of locating more cards across the country. And that's one reason we're doing a dog and pony show, getting information out there, and we keep discovering that there are some cards around, like in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I haven't seen them yet, but they're supposed to be there. Her article in the Indiana Genealogist in 2013 helped in this regard. It was followed up in local newspapers and national online posts. The Jasper County cards themselves have been scanned, and as the Grand Rapids cards have, and certain fields indexed for posting soon on the IGS website. And I'll let Sue tell you more about how Jasper County Hooverized its women as part of the national project. Do you have it?
Should I need an extra hand?
It's not.
You must have pressed it up here.
Okay, I'll try this. Can you hear me okay? Well, during World War I, President Wilson realized it was absolutely essential that all American people get to work and think as one group and not as individuals, in order to reduce dissension and to reduce the thinking about the tragic consequences being faced by our soldiers overseas. So began a massive political indoctrination program to gain patriotic support for all war activities. These programs were carried out through the Community Councils of Defense, the coordination of efforts of various women's and charitable organizations, the Propaganda Committee of the Council of National Defense, the work of the Food Administration, and many other organizations. In Jasper County, the women sewed shirts and handkerchiefs, knitted socks, saved metal and used clothing, registered women in the county, mailed care packages to local soldiers, made medical bandages, weighed and measured children, joined the nursing reserve, and many, many other things. There was, however, one overriding project, and that was the food conservation program. Food conservation was so important that the term "to Hooverize" became synonymous not only with conservation of food, but with all the other items that needed to be saved for war efforts. It was the woman of the house who learned the new cold pack method of canning, how to garden, how to cook using alternatives to restricted foods. She also had to keep up on an ever-changing regulations regarding the purchasing and usage of restricted items. A massive newspaper propaganda campaign centered on repeatedly defining the actions that identify a patriotic citizen. As kind of a side note, it's important to note that when you look at the various war posters, you will notice that women are portrayed as competent, intelligent, able to take on new challenges, such as becoming a nurse, a Rosie the Riveter, or fighting for child welfare. The positive tone of these posters is far different from the tone expressed in the daily newspapers. In 1917 and 1918, a significant portion of the newspaper campaign centered on food. Subjects included information on the quantity of food needed to feed the soldiers, transportation of food, fuel conservation, the dire needs of the people starving in Europe, how we could quickly get over our cravings for sugar and learn to live with reduced amounts, cases of disregard of government regulations, information on conservation programs being held in communities locally, and ads regarding the use of food substitutes. The articles were sometimes humorous, always educational or usually educational, sometimes very gory in their comparisons of the small sacrifices expected of the American women in comparison with those of their foreign counterparts, or even in comparison with the American men who were fighting overseas. And they were very derogatory towards anyone out of compliance with government thinking and initiatives. This excerpt, written for the Propaganda Committee, is an excellent example of how seriously the government expected the people to react to the food directives. One article in great big capital letters said, "Get this fact into your head." Now, does that sound like you're talking to somebody intelligent? It went on to say, now the United States Food Administration does not propose to be content with putting pieces in the paper about the seriousness of the food situation and trusting people to respond in any way their individual consciences happen to dictate. There is no doubt that the public means well, but response now must be quick, unified, and consistent. We'll now talk a little bit about the food pledge cards. You saw this before in Anita's. In 1917, Hoover asked women to sign pledge cards that they would abide by the food restrictions being requested by the administration. Pledge cards were distributed with the support of the women's section of the County Council of Defense Units and were intended to be mailed back to the Food Administration in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, the Hoover Pledge Card Project was a hard sell in many areas of the country, and it was especially hard in some of the rural areas like Jasper County, where self-sufficient farm families were told they could not bake bread out of the wheat they'd grown in their own fields, or they couldn't butcher the chickens and eat them on a meatless day. Throughout Indiana, various organizations were asked to help with the collecting of the cards, because people were not sending them in as they should. Church and ladies' organizations and even Boy Scouts were asked to participate in collecting the cards. Pledge card stations were set up in many of the stores. In spite of months of serious efforts by many county councils of defense, progress in getting the cards signed was so slow in Indiana that our state organizers called the cards back for several weeks while they came up with another plan of attack. Under the revised plans, a Patriotic Week was started in Jasper County schools in late October, and the pledge cards were provided to the teachers. Now, we have no reports of real issues of opposition to the school activities in Jasper County, although one township that we know of did not bother to distribute the cards a second time because they felt they'd collected as many as the first time as they were going to collect. In Elkhart County, there was an uproar created by a janitor who did not believe that children should be brought into this project. And there was also a Mennonite minister who threw cards in the fire because his church, like the Dunkers of Jasper County, did not believe in supporting any type of war effort. After a week of intensive political indoctrination, school children were asked to sign a food pledge card, and then were given Hoover pledge cards that you need to show you to take home to mother. Can you imagine a child coming home and saying, "Mommy, I did my patriotic duty and completed this card. Why won't you do yours?" The pressure on women to sign the cards was intensive, as shown by two Lafayette Courier articles. Oops, it didn't move over for me. There. And this was the long time. Now, I want you to listen to the intensity of the wording in this article. A man is branded as a slacker when he shirks the military allegiance he owes his country and allows some other man to do his fighting for him. A woman is a slacker when through ignorance, indifference, or neglect, she ignores every appeal made to her by Uncle Sam and refuses to cooperate in those great undertakings through which America hopes to make the world safe for democracy. Another article was titled Food Pledge Week, much simpler title. Those who refuses to accept such a simple responsibility as making an effort to help feed our armies is worse than a traitor. You get a little different tone there when you read the articles in the newspapers. That was certainly not a nice way to talk to farm women who were having to bring in boys working reserve young men to help save their farms from foreclosure, or women who are now managing the businesses for family members who are fighting overseas. Sorry.
It's this room.
By the end of November, the pledge card project was pretty much halted in our county. The government reported the 50% of the households that signed the pledge cards and considered that number high, sufficiently high to call Hoover's project a success. Indiana finally reported that 400,000 out of an expected 700,000 cards were signed, resulting in a 57% return. So we ended up doing pretty well. Prior to the country's entry into the war, several food clubs were started in the county by Purdue University. These would be the first of what would be eventually known as home economics clubs. And they were probably the basis for the U.S. food club idea. During the war, statewide plans were made for covering every square inch of Indiana with 5,000 United States Foods Clubs for preaching and practicing conservation. United States Food Club number 1 was in Spencer County, Indiana. In Jasper County, 70 food clubs were established. And by mid-1918, at least a dozen other states were following the same process of setting up the food clubs. Joining food clubs was not necessarily a voluntary thing. Signers of food pledge cards were automatically enrolled in the neighborhood food club. Newspapers warned those who didn't sign that their names were given to the neighborhood club members so they could ascertain why the others hadn't signed. Fortunately, the new food clubs were actually well accepted by the women. They loved them. A variety of canning and cooking programs took place at the clubs and also at other women's organizations and in schools. One report indicated that a total of 6,112 county women attended the programs. Now, we had less than 14,000 people in the county, so attendance was pretty good. As part of the conservation program, there was a nationwide movement to encourage city dwellers and farmers who already didn't have them to plant the victory or war gardens. In Jasper County, 500 people were helped with some phase of garden work, and over 20 training sessions were held on maintaining orchards. A resolution passed by the Jasper County Council of Defense insisted that all vacant and unused lots be cultivated, and that the owners of lots who refused to cultivate or who attempted to collect excess rent for them would be considered unpatriotic. Reports published after the war state that there were 4,000 gardens in our county. Considered only 14,000 people, that's a lot. That may have been a total for 2 summers, but still it was a huge number of gardens for a small area. Gardening was one of the most successful projects taken on by local women. While 90 miles away, the people living in Chicago were experiencing shortages of fresh produce and paying sky-high prices for what they could find. Jasper County had such an abundance of vegetables that prices hit absolute rock bottom. You couldn't give it away. At one point, Jasper County Council of Defense received letters from the Indiana U.S. Food Administrator asking the council to report incidences of food or wheat being given to hogs. However, once the home canning was done, there was no other option. The roads were so bad they couldn't take it to Chicago and sell it to the people there. And the commercial canneries were so busy they weren't buying from the small individuals. Shortly after, another government directive came out encouraging the feeding of the hogs rather than letting the food rot in the fields. Constantly changing regulations created confusion. Frequent notices were sent to merchants explaining current food restrictions, substitution requirements, and price controls. Regulations were constantly changing as to the amounts of certain foods available per person or for the size of the family. We at various times followed an 80-20 rule, a 50-50 rule, and for a while there was even a no wheat rule. At one point, buying sugar for canning required a special permit. In addition, people followed meatless days, wheatless days, so on. There were times in the winter when the merchants were required to reduce their hours of being open in order to save fuel. And the restaurants had their own sets of rules. So the rules were very extensive. Merchants were required to record the sale of restricted items, the name of the purchaser, the amount, and the date purchased. By tracking sales, the Food Administration was able to prove cases of hoarding. Incidents of non-compliance of food regulations were widely publicized throughout the state as a way of shaming the perpetrators and also letting women know which merchants were liable to cheat them. Minutes of the local Council of Defense reported on 2 merchants called before the council for selling bread at a price higher than that allowed by the government and also for selling wheat on wheatless days. And an unknown tipster let the Food Administration in Indianapolis know about the daughter-in-law of one of our council members who was storing flour in an upstairs bedroom. And she had her flour taken away from her because they checked with the local merchants and found she was buying it when the purchases were illegal. We also had 500 pounds of sugar taken back by the Food Administration after Mr. Oliver lied about owning a canning factory in Jasper County. No food was out of bounds when it came to restrictions. Indiana Food Administration told a church lady that members could not eat Wienerwurst sandwiches on wheatless days, and he even told her that there were fines of up to $5,000 and 2 years in prison for not obeying the food restrictions. Next Sundays and soda fountain drinks requiring sugar syrups were not allowed. One bulletin reminded people that you don't have to freeze your innards by slamming fragments of iceberg into all the food and drink served during hot weather. You see, ammonia was used in the production of ice. It was also needed in the production of military equipment. And also cutting down on the delivery of ice saved fuel for war efforts. During this period of time, almost all newspapers had an extensive number of advertisements. Let's see here. This is one of them. Really, why it was the public's patriotic duty to observe substitutions. The ads listed various substitutes for wheat and different ways you could use. You could use cornmeal, corn grits, barley flour, rice flour, buckwheat flour, hominy, so on. Gruesome descriptions encouraged women to cooperate and to feel very guilty if they did not. An article entitled, "Eat Your War Bread Now," issued this warning. Share your wheat with the Allies. Better eat war bread now than eat black bread of Germany later. There are not substitutes for eyesight lost by an exploding shell. There are substitutes for wheat flour. Ought we grumble about the flour substitute rule? Some of you never heard that the government was this nasty. My favorite ad was a heart-wrenching drawing of 3 barefoot French women with ropes tied around their waists so they could pull a large plow across the field. Their horses had been taken by the Germans to either pull military equipment or to be eaten for fuel. And it certainly had a dramatic effect on me when I saw it, so I can't imagine how the women of the country reacted to it. There wasn't much opposition to the food restrictions listed in the paper, but there were a few little things that stuck in. And this one is a poem about the end of a meatless day. We had another one about a colonist using cats and guns and going out to kill rats in the wheat field. He felt that would do more good than having wheatless days. And still another humorous joke that thus far we have noticed no amendment in the food bill making it unlawful for a person to sell liquor to a congressman. The armistice was finally signed in November of 18, but many of the food programs went on for close to a year until the soldiers came back home and the Europeans had time to harvest their 1919 crop. Locally, good news was reported in the minutes of the General Van Rensselaer Daughters of the American Republic chapter in November of 1919. It stated, "A delicious hot lunch was served, the kind we used to have before the war."
And that's Hooverizing and managing the nation's women. I would like to stress once more, I sort of said this. I don't think we mentioned that most of Anita's research was done in the National Archives in Bethesda. Sue's material comes virtually exclusively from the local sources in that cabinet in Rensselaer, Indiana. So it has to be interesting to the two of them. I saw some heads nodding, like, oh yeah, I've seen that, I've heard about that. So there's some cross-checking going on here between the local and the national efforts. Okay.
Sorry.
I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
after his graduate work in ecological food and farming systems at Michigan State University, Jason Otto's professional life has included teaching anthropology at Aquinas College in Grand Rapids and consulting on such varied projects as MSU's Center for Regional Food Systems and GVSU's ethnographic field school. Most recently, his article, Municipal Housekeepers and the High Cost of Living, appeared in the 2017 book, Cities of Farmers. Over the years, he has reviewed books and grants in history of food marketing and urban agriculture, one for the USDA National Institute of Food Agriculture. He has published an online annotated bibliography of food environment literature. At the same time, he was gaining on-the-ground experience in his field as market manager and farm inspector for the Grand Rapids Fulton Street Farmers Market, where he also served on the market redevelopment committee. So Jason has been all over in this arena. Schoolyard patriots and municipal housekeeping.
Thanks. First of all, before I get going, an interesting thing with Sue's, so in urban areas, the meat consumption actually went up, even though people acted like it didn't, because the women had more money because they were working overtime in the factories and whatnot. So it's kind of interesting when what the reality is compared to what they wanted people to do. So those women all owed $5,000 to the government. So I'm going to stick with my paper here because I tend to, I'll get off track and we'll be here forever. So I'm kind of in a feedback loop on the progressive era and women in Grand Rapids, so I can't help myself. So, first of all, in the spring of 1917, 2 weeks before Woodrow Wilson declared war on Germany, Eva McCall Hamilton stepped into the council chamber of Grand Rapids and demanded an unpopular appropriation of funds for a retail farmers market. She had been appointed to a commission in the mayor's office to investigate the high cost of living in Grand Rapids. As part of that committee, she conducted a study of municipal markets in cities of similar size. Armed with this and other data, she challenged the knowledge of the men that were opposed to the market. These aldermen had direct connections to grocers They've been dragging out motions on building a retail market for 5 years. They kept going back and forth on where they wanted the market and other things like that. And it was a 5-year filibuster is what it was. It's not a surprise because many of these men and their mentors were part of earlier legislation that forced all of the farmers in Grand Rapids to the city wholesale market on the island from 1896 until this time. So it was illegal for the farmers to actually be on city streets and selling straight to housewives. So this paper, this paper uses Hamilton's victory at the city council as a vantage point to look back and a little forward on some of this domestic work that was being done, or quote domestic work, being done by civically engaged women. More specifically, it focuses on public gardening programs in Grand Rapids, of which women had a major role. Situating this civic work into a larger context of shifting gender roles leading up to and through the First World War. So women's institutions like the Ladies Literary Club and the General Federation of Women's Clubs organized multiple civic campaigns, mobilizing a large network of women throughout the city. At the turn of the century, their members were beginning to come from a generation of middle-class women with college degrees. Many studied fledgling social sciences of the time. They were beginning to wrestle with the lopsided results of industrialization in cities. They were using the scientific methods to fix urban ills, basically. Many on-the-ground organizations in Grand Rapids, such as the Mothers Clubs, which is one of those right there, at schools, worked with the women of the more prestigious clubs who were either professionals and usually single, or the wives and daughters of powerful capitalists. Educators rounded out this constellation of women that was working to keep neighborhoods of workers beautiful and healthy. Grand Rapids prided itself on having a progressive school system, which usually had the support of the school board and also the city council to experiment with new ideas, like the open air school. So Walker's School was built with a special ventilation system, so you could have heated classrooms or open air classrooms, depending on what the pedagogical idea was at the time. So if you know anything about that time period, they thought maybe cold air could help kids. Public gardening programs were started and promoted in the schools, and they were universally popular as opposed to the farmers markets. So in 1912, journalist Frederick J. Haskin, who's the man who actually operated the Google of his time, he wrote a syndicated column in the New York Times where you could write in, and he sat on the world's largest information bureau in Washington, D.C. and answered any of your questions. I actually have his book somewhere, I couldn't find it. So he wrote a column on the work of women's clubs, and in it he described the shift from Dante and Browning to being and doing as the women clubs moved out of the clubhouse and onto the streets. He went on to explain why. He says, the interest of club women in civic work is only a recognition of the fact that all work pertaining to the welfare of the community is an enlarged form of housekeeping, and therefore of natural interest to women. While the establishment of playgrounds, free baths, pure water supplies, the abatement of the smoke nuisance, and kindred other matters are fine and feminine works, there is yet a deeper significance in civics than any of these. It includes a constant and relentless warfare against any form of evil, wherever it may be found. So, women of any time period have operated within the sphere which is created by men based on women's biology. Work that involves socialization of young people, cleanliness, subsistence food production, processing, protection of cultural mores, and other, quote, domestic responsibilities is considered feminine in most cultures. Such gendered spheres were very pronounced in the Progressive era and became challenged during the war. Anita uncovered some literature from activist Emily Newell Blair during the war that used a wall as metaphor to describe separation of these gendered spheres. The public nature of women's work during the war began eroding some of the mortar on that wall. Eva McCall Hamilton and her colleagues, continuing with the metaphor, chinked a pretty good-sized chunk of mortar off the wall in Grand Rapids when they directly influenced a decision at City Hall. History tends to praise her passage of laws for the well-being of women and children when she became senator. And while such decisions were necessary and important, they were still done reaching over the wall, right? What was revolutionary was the fact that she had votes on non-feminine bills, like the creation of the Department of Labor, and decisions on big financing at the state level. Her votes on these less domestic masculine issues gave her the same clout as any man in the public domain, so she actually jumped the wall, right? So some of the first public gardening programs in Grand Rapids were started by Dr. Francis Rutherford. Dr. Rutherford is one of the earliest American female physicians. She moved to Grand Rapids in 1868 and was the city physician for a short time. She was also one of the founders of the Ladies Literary Club, and in 1904 she took control of the newly formed Civic Health and Beauty Committee. This committee began gardening programs after a talk by Howard Strong of the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce, which started a long relationship between gardeners of Cleveland and also with Grand Rapids. As an experiment, 3,000 seed packets were distributed to 6 schools with a $10 prize offered for the school with the best flowers. At the end of the season, addresses were given to members of the committee, and they traveled around the city with some of the donors of the program to inspect the flower beds. And I wish this was a better picture because that'd be awesome to see them all in their cars, in their automobiles, right? The experiment was a success, and it grew into tens of thousands of seeds each year at all the public and parochial schools. Prizes were given to individuals and schools with the best specimens, school and home gardens, and displays. And the top finishers actually got to show at the West Michigan State Fair, which is, I found this picture of the inside of it. I can't remember where now. I should have it up there, but I don't, sorry. I was pretty excited myself. My wife has a picture of the outside of it. Okay, where was it? Wait. So tying curriculum to gardening was always part of the program, as students would not be able to get more seeds for the next year, and they wouldn't be able to compete in the exhibits if they didn't write a letter to the superintendent of the public schools. Okay? Some of these, quote, quaint epistles, they called them, were printed in the paper without correction, and provide a rich resource with an unfiltered glimpse into the lives of everyday people. For example, one student writes, oh, hey. Sorry about that. It's not real convenient. I feel like I'm on a game show. Okay, so one student writes, Dear Mr. Elson, I got some nasturtium seeds and also a package of morning glories too, of Dr. Rutherford and Mr. Martin. I planted about half of nasturtium seeds, and after 2 weeks they began to shoot upward through the ground. They grew very fast, and after they were about 3 inches tall, I had to leave them, and I'm very sorry I had to. We had to move out of our place. I did plant more seeds in our new place, but the chickens ate them. So this is my second misfortune. And it is too late to plant more seeds. I think I would better wait until next spring and have a good garden then. And it may be if I live as long as next spring, I'll write you another report of my flowers. Who knows what's going on. So there's a treasure trove similar to these. I found some of them, but I'd like to find more. Because the kids will say what's actually happening, right? All right, so Superintendent Elson, who actually is the guy that wrote the Dick and Jane book, by the way, had a couple of acres plowed at 2nd Avenue School in 1903 for vegetables. This was a working class school in a poorer neighborhood. However, the garden was not explicitly a relief garden. Elson states, the work is not being done for the sport connected with the gardening, but for the sake of securing practical results, not so much in vegetables raised, but because of the experience the children will have gained. Talks from professors, visiting garden experts, and others became commonplace. All promoted gardening as the key to good kids in the city as it brings out their civilized being. For example, one speaker said, if farm gardening were introduced into the 8th grades of our public schools, by 1950 the prisons and workhouses would fall into decay for lack of occupants. In another article, they said one of the penalties of urban life is that the younger generation too often becomes removed from that close contact with the soil, which makes for sane ideals and high-minded citizenship. So we got some agrarian country life stuff going on, right? One would believe gardening was like magic. It was not unfamiliar rhetoric, though. Rural life and connection with the soil were the ideal situations for human existence, and urban life was considered evil. As the school board began lending more support for gardens, newly appointed Superintendent Greason, a staunch reporter of manual training, fully embraced the program. Oakdale School, of which most students were Dutch immigrants, was the most successful. That's one picture I can find. It's horrible, sorry. Principal Van Buren, Francis Van Buren, forged a relationship with the head of gardens in Cleveland, Miss Louise Klein Miller, who was becoming one of the preeminent garden consultants for the country. When Miller visited Grand Rapids in 1913, she was impressed by Van Buren's work. She spoke multiple times in Grand Rapids and visited most of the schools. At one of her talks, she said, in Cleveland, defective children have been materially helped, and many of the older boys become farmers' assistants. The school gardens are the basis of nature study, and from the cultivation of flowers and vegetables, the children are instructed in the great principles of reproduction as applied to plant life, And from the subject of the subject of eugenics is tactfully approached. The subject of better flowers and better vegetables easily leads to the subject of better people. So as an anthropologist, it is impossible to ignore the fact that this was a dark time in the social sciences. Tacit influence of social Darwinism is clear in much of the literature at school gardens. This paper will not go deep into the paternalistic nature of the gardens. That'll be my paper Friday, hopefully. I'm kind of going that direction. But such thinking was implicitly behind much of the work and should be considered when studying schools for this period. In 1915, the Chamber of Commerce appointed Anna McKnight as the chair of the newly created Civic Beauty Committee. This organization, well funded by banks and local businesses, organized neighborhood improvement districts, precursors to the modern neighborhood association. During the summers of 1915 and 16, her organization sponsored garden contests for the burgeoning Boys and Girls Clubs. Her Cleaner Greener campaign received a lot of press with great articles that talk about everyday people, which are just a score to find when you find them talking to actually real people. However, her work was overshadowed when the Kent County Cooperative Extension stepped in. State leader of the Boys and Girls Club, Edward C. Lindeman, he heard of Grand Rapids' successful gardening programs, and he chose the city as a place to organize Boys and Girls Clubs, record their experiences, and hopefully end up with a good, duplicable model. The state agriculturist had financial support from Clay Hollister at the Old National Bank and the school and superintendent. H.G. Smith, the county agriculturalist, assisted Lindeman, and they also hired Joseph Machapka as city gardening supervisor. Men had taken over, so there was a complete division of labor shift here. A shift in the division of labor based on gender was very apparent now that the Boys and Girls Clubs became a scientific sample. Additionally, this was the first time results were given in dollar amounts. But there's an interesting anomaly here. So looking deeper into the budget, you find this. So Miss Grace Watson, she's the Oakdale school supervisor, but she is paid $30 more a month than Machapka, who's the city garden supervisor. Watson made over 600 home visits during the growing season, and it's no wonder that one of the final recommendations of the study was to hire more supervisors like Grace Watson. By the time the war gardens were a thing, Grand Rapids had already mobilized. The Old National Bank, which was one of the largest donors of the school gardening program, also had been organizing vacant lot gardens for families, along with the municipal program promoted by the Mayor's High Cost of Living Commission. Yield estimates for the year from 5,000 acres in the local papers, and if they're anything close to actual, Grand Rapids was a leader in production for the U.S. Although bankmen like William Murphy and Clay Hollister took the lead in garden positions, women were still actively organizing the Boys and Girls Clubs. Each part of town had a supervisor that was a woman that lived in the area. Additionally, the Michigan Agricultural College appointed a county canning supervisor who would work closely with H.G. Smith to make sure none of the bumper crop was wasted. So Emily Castle, she was a graduate of Michigan Agricultural College and native of Mount Clemens, Michigan. She conducted over 50 canning demonstrations for over 4,000 women in 1917 in Grand Rapids. Her patriotic foment and woman power in the local paper is pretty evident when she says, "Surely, the instances are rare when any woman can feel there is anything more important to her than knowing how to increase the food supply. Whatever may be a woman's interest in life, surely she has none greater than life itself, and food means life. And our nation is crying, food, more food, more food. Let it not be said that the women of Grand Rapids and Kent County failed in the seemingly small things which were needed to accomplish great things which America needs this year." Emily Castle was assisted by Fern Rowe during many of her canning demonstrations. She's the one on the left here, shown at the War Committee's Canning Center, actually. Mrs. Rowe was chair of the Committee on Patriotism for the Eagle Franchise Club for the Women's Committee of the Council of National Defense. However, according to a correspondence from Justina Hollister to Carolyn Bartlett Crane, Rowe was to take care of all things pertaining to food. This is peculiar since there were committees on food with their own chairs. One of Ema Hamilton's colleagues during her campaign for markets and vacant lot gardens was Emily Chamberlain, an art critic that was a wealthy widow active in local civics. She was president of the Grand Rapids Federation of Women's Club during the war and had arranged meetings with the mayor and food merchants, leading to the creation of the High Cost of Living Commission, which she was a part of, Ann Hamilton, asking for a second farmers market to be established in the city in 1918. The first farmers market on Leonard, just west of the river, was successful beyond imagination, and they wanted another market in another working class neighborhood down on South Division Avenue. Chamberlain used the war committee for leverage, claiming, since we thoroughly believe food will win the war, we also believe that the establishment of markets will tend not only to bring producer and consumer into a closer relationship, but that they will encourage greater food production by providing an outlet for the surplus of the home gardener as well. Hollister's correspondences with Carolyn Bartlett Crane are our main supporting documents for the committee in Grand Rapids. And of course, her letters do not always fit with the other sources from the time. I don't want to downplay the Herculean task of registering the thousands of women in Grand Rapids, but at the same time, I have a lot of questions. Like, when and why did Emily Chamberlain join the war committee? And even more interesting is, why does Ava Hamilton not show up anywhere on the war committee or in any war work? And in general, how does she leverage so much political clout without being overtly patriotic during the war? Right? So she became our first woman senator, and she does not exist in the war work. Also, why does Justina Hollister write a scathing letter about Anna McKnight, telling Bartlett Crane that she is, quote, not felt to be sincere about many things, and she doesn't want her in any committees because she has no real power or authority? There's so many questions. So to finish, I'm just going to kind of talk about after the war. So Grace Watson, the city actually hires her on as city supervisor, from what I can find, at least until 1920. I want to do more work on her because she's pretty interesting. Anna McKnight, her husband dies in 1919. She takes over the logging business and she travels the world. So this is her at Giants Causeway, actually. And the library has some great pictures. Justina Hollister, her son died in the war. She went through kind of a moment of mourning. But by 1920, she was back on the road again of helping women grow more food. This was during the ag crisis of 20, right? Emily Castle, she became the state assistant supervisor of Boys and Girls Clubs in 1918. Then she got married in 1919 to Wilfred Williams. She was kind of supervisor, surveyor, and she became the organist of Grace Episcopal Church for 30 years. She kind of, yeah. And then finally, Mrs. Chamberlain. Mrs. Chamberlain, really, people call Eva Hamilton the mother of our farmers markets, but this lady is. Eva Chamberlain stuck with it all the way into the 1930s. She was doing stuff, and in the 40s she was working on stuff in the city. She was with art and everything. But this is an interesting committee that she was on for markets, along with Helen Russell, who was also, these two were both on the High Cost of Living Commission back in 1917, which is kind of interesting. They called them back again in 1928 and said, hey, how are our markets doing? And these are suggestions they gave, okay, no. And then there's one other question mark here, and I want to end on this one. It's kind of a trivial thing, but it says that that covered sheds be built to protect from sun and inclement weather. Okay? So 84 years later, she gets what she wants. All right.
Jason just...
Oh, sorry, I just turned it off.
Turn it back on. Jason just shot us fast beyond mostly collecting data. We've been out scavenging for all kinds of information and good questions raised. I could ask all kinds of questions, but I wanted to give you a chance to first. Responses, questions about Women's Committee efforts and how they intersected even with what Jason has been describing. Sometimes they did with public gardening programs in the bigger cities, sometimes they didn't. Yes?
The first one I have is, question I have is for the first presentation of Anita. With the Women's Committee, with other women's groups like the Women's Land Army of America during the same time, who were emulating like a British model, or something like the Women's Committee or other women's groups this time kind of following a similar British pattern? Because I know that's kind of, a lot of groups during this time in the war, they're all modeled like kind of like a European group. Is the same thing sort of happening here?
In some ways, yeah. The Women's Committee would model themselves after the British and the French. But the Women's Land Army in particular modeled themselves after French and British examples, much more so. Part of the thing is the Women's Land Army, they kind of competed with the Women's Committee, but in different ways. When it comes to food production, the Women's Land Army was really designed for women who were single and usually late teenagers, early 20s, to go out like migrant workers almost into fields to pick crops and to produce food. Where the Women's Committee is specifically designed for any woman, and they really wanted women at home who already had families. So usually the women who were part of the Women's Committee farm movements were not part of the Women's Land Army at all. But having said that, the director, the national director for the Women's Land Army was also a co-director on the Women's Committee, on the national level. So what happens is oftentimes the Women's Committee will hear of good programs like the Women's Land Army, sort of co-opt some of those things, but also co-opt their directors to work with the Women's Committee on a national or state or regional level. So to answer your question shortly now that I did the long version, is a little bit they model themselves after, especially the French, but also the British model. Those were influencing decisions made, but this, for the food programs, it was real piecemeal, because there was no, besides, as you heard from Sue, there was moments where the Food Administration were very picky and very heavy-handed, and then other times where they would change rules suddenly or sort of slack off a little bit in how much they were enforcing those rules. So the Women's Committee was constantly kind of stuck between trying to figure out what did the Food Administration want, which in Britain and France, I don't think they had quite that much confusion going on when it came to their food programs.
Thank you. I would like to point out that unless Jason has done it, and I'm not aware of it, we really have not in Grand Rapids dug into the newspapers. We don't have the kinds of records that Sue has, clipped out and in notebooks in Rensselaer. But very quickly.
Yeah, so I've done some research on the newspapers on the Women's Committee. The Women's Committee, and from where I'm sitting right now on it, is they were kind of up here doing the similar things they were doing as the Ladies Literary Club, kind of pulling the strings. So the things I mainly find are they were doing display things in the windows. They had a display exhibit at the state fair. They had Hoover luncheons where they had meatless luncheons, and they fed the reservists when they came to town, and they made money at 25 cents a plate that they would send to other people. So that's all I mean. Yeah. That's from the
Grand Rapids in particular, over the space of, I think it was 1 week, in Grand Rapids, to speak of the money they made, because the Women's Committee food programs made money for the Women's Committee. The Chicago women sold potato chips and used that to fund their food programs on the streets. They sold these. But in particular in Grand Rapids, there was a moment where 800 men had reported on their way to go to boot camp, basically. They had to report to Grand Rapids, and they were held here waiting for trains to take them out for a week. And the Grand Rapids Women's Committee, the local branch, actually fed them and then charged the federal government a reduced rate for those meals and got money from the federal government. Mind you, none of the state women committees, as well as the national, but the state committees, the largest funded effort was in Pennsylvania, and for the entire, not just food programs, the entire committee was only given $23,000 to run indefinitely until the war was over.
Thanks. You can see this is ground level work we're doing now, starting rural and urban comparisons, and next year we'll move into another arena, but it should be fascinating.
I know you all talked about different sorts of almost female-specific programs during World War I. I know in France, when the women worked in the factories, they were pretty much delegated back to their maternal roles. What happened to these committees after World War I ended? Did they continue on, or did they end up like the French?
Really succinct response. Anita's dealt with this.
That's a good question. What happened to the Women's Committee, the Council of National Defense, again, they're part of that. That's a male-led committee. Most of those men had business contacts and large industries and transportation and so forth. But after the war, after the armistice, within 6 months of that, the Women's Committee on the national level is shut down by the federal government. They're told they're no longer needed, so they lose all federal authority. However, several of the state divisions of the Women's Committee will continue to run, some of them until 1923. So it's kind of piecemeal, and a lot of it is based on which state you were in, what the needs were immediately after the war, including the Spanish flu, but also food needs. Some of those state divisions remained in operation. Michigan and I think Indiana both were done by the summer of 1919, if I remember correctly.
Thanks, Sue. Want to add anything about rural?
Well, just on the local level, the head of our unit was a Mrs. Ora T. Ross, and she went on to become very well known around the community. She established the public library system and just took on one project after another in the community after that.
So in this case, it sounds like a natural leader was identified.
Yes.
Because of the war movement and remained effective later.
Just to add to the question you asked about the French example, by 1923, what's happening in the United States with that Equal Rights Amendment being proposed for the first time is a lot of the women who had staffed the Women's Committee either on the local level, the state, or the national level were then accused of somehow, as they called it at the time, Prussianizing, basically making socialist or communist overturns in their program. So they were not only done with the Women's Committee by 1923, all the state divisions, but what happened is the women who did participate, especially in the national and the state levels, began to be very quiet about it because they didn't want to be threatened or accused of starting socialist ideas.
In fact, in Grand Rapids in 1919, once women had been enfranchised by the statesmen in November 1918, there were women running on the socialist ticket.
Sue, you mentioned the children who were given the pledge cards to sign in school and then take pledge cards home to their parents. Was that a local initiative, a state initiative, or even a national initiative? Because I was thinking of the whole thing with kids and the anti-smoking and how public schools are often used to pressure families, and I was wondering just where this came from.
What I was reporting on was an Indiana project.
State level.
Yes. And there were stories that when a kid would bring a piece of candy into school that week, that they would be openly ridiculed by the other students and the teachers alike, and things like that. But I think other places did something similar with the children.
To get to Rob's question just briefly, there is a sort of national movement to use kids in schools, public schools specifically, to sort of bring these pledge cards home to their mothers in particular. And it becomes modeled after what they would do in Manistee, Michigan. Manistee, Michigan becomes the Midwest model for food programs. And in Manistee, they started within the space of 1 week to collect 21,000 Hoover cards, food pledge cards, but also to go out and part of that process of collecting those cards were to make sure every public school child that week got at least one pledge card to bring home, and oftentimes 2 or 3 to give out to grandmothers as well.
Emily Castle brought a 10-year-old when she was canning. So there was a 10-year-old girl that Emily Castle would bring to canning things and be like, look, she can do it. Like, she did it all the time.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, I want to compliment Jason on your information and where you got it. And I mean, I haven't heard this before. I'm with Wyoming Historical Commission. And
Mr.
also,
Tillman. George P. Tillman. He was your mayor for a while.
Yes.
He was the mayor here in 1917.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
And the interesting thing is that there was the agricultural fair and grounds in Hall Street. Then it moved down to Kent County area on South Division, off from South Division over in that area there. And the interesting thing is during World War I era there, there were a lot of connections, and there's a Burton Register. Burton had a newspaper, Burton Heights,
Yeah.
that told about all this stuff during World War I.
Yeah.
And the Herald also told a lot about the areas from Hall Street south.
Right.
And it's interesting about how these families and women and schools were involved in all this agricultural activity.
Right.
And it included also the pork farm.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, they sent girls down to Wyoming. There was a farm in Wyoming that they sent girls to from Grand Rapids that were the truant girls. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like to know more about this.
yes, I'd like to help you out on that.
Yeah, definitely, thank you. Yeah.
Well, since we're a farming community, we also had a lot of the industrial clubs, they called them, but they were corn club, sheep club, cow clubs, all this type of thing. And those were very active in the schools and kind of the forerunner to 4-H clubs.
Is it true that home economics programs sort of developed out of some of this activity, or had that started already?
Purdue had 3 clubs in
Okay.
Jasper County about 1911 to 1913.
Okay.
And then that's where they thought that a lot of the Indiana food club thing was kind of based on those, but whether they were for sure or not, we aren't positive.
As the 1911, 1910, you have a scare recession, whatever. Food prices were jacking up like crazy during that time, and so fighting the high cost of living was a huge thing, and it was on women to do it because women were being blamed for it because they didn't know how to shop right.
So women were defending themselves in part.
Yeah, yeah.
This has been fun. We've scratched the surface. I want to mention just one quick thing. Deborah Buffton did a paper this morning at 10:15 on the peace movement that women were involved in. I don't know
Eva
about
Hamilton,
McCall
she actually
Hamilton.
started our piece.
Yeah, okay,
She started
so
our piece part
I
of
was
the
going to
year.
suggest, I didn't know that, but I was going to suggest that could be a reason.
Yes.
Also, we didn't touch on this today, I thought we might, but Grand Rapids had an extremely small African-American population at the time, but women were involved. And so we'll be getting back to that information as well too. Thank you so much for coming.